My name is Iomid. I am 34 years old, and on the morning of September the 4th, I watched the 4 men I would later cook alive eat their breakfast without spilling a single drop of coffee. They laughed at the table. They passed the butter. They spoke about the harvest while the oil in my kitchen was still warm from what they had done just hours before. I stood in that doorway holding a cast-iron pan, and I made a decision that no church, no law, and no God had the right to take from me. What I did that Christmas Eve was not madness. It was mathematics. It was the only equation in this world that ever balanced perfectly. And before this story is over, you will understand exactly why I have no regrets. If this story already has your heart beating faster, you're not alone. Hit that subscribe button and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. Every comment, every like, helps my family keep these stories alive. Now stay with me, because what happened next changed everything. But to understand what I became, you need to understand what they destroyed first. Because the woman who walked into that kitchen on Christmas night was not the same woman who had once sung hymns over a wood stove and braided her daughter's hair by candlelight. That woman died in September. What rose in her place was something older, something that had been sleeping in my blood since before I was born on African soil. I need you to stay with me through every word of this story, because what happened inside that house on Thornwood Plantation is something that will follow you long after you stop listening. And I promise you, nothing will prepare you for what came next. The Thornwood Plantation sat low against the Georgia earth, like something the land itself was ashamed of. The main house was white, always white, with columns that caught the morning light and made visitors think of grace and order. But behind that house, past the magnolia trees that smelled sweet enough to make you forget where you were, there was my world. A kitchen building with a dirt floor that turned to mud when it rained. Walls so thin I could hear the wind argue with itself at night. A single window, small as a Bible, that faced east. So the first thing I saw every morning was the sun rising over fields worked by people who would never own the ground beneath their feet. The smell of wood smoke never left those walls. It had soaked into the timber like memory soaks into bone. That kitchen was my prison, and later it became my courtroom. My days began before the roosters found their voice. I was up while the stars were still deciding whether to stay or go. Stoking embers, hauling water, rendering lard, kneading dough with hands that cracked and bled through the winter months. By the time the Thornwood family sat down to their breakfast, I had already lived half a day. I cook 3 full meals, clean the dishes, preserve the meats, manage the smokehouse, and train the younger girls who came to help. On Sundays, at night, I fell onto my straw mattress like a tree that had finally been cut. Isaiah would find me there, half asleep, and he would press his forehead against mine without a single word. That was enough. That silence between us was the most honest language either of us ever spoke. It was everything. But there was a wound I carried long before that September morning, one that had never been allowed to close. 2 years before Edmund Thornwood had sold my eldest boy, Samuel, to a man from Louisiana. Samuel was 11. He still slept curled like a question mark, still called for me in the night when thunder came. I stood in the yard and watched the wagon take him down the red clay road until the dust swallowed him whole. Edmund watched me watch my son disappear, and he said without blinking, "You can make another one." I smiled. God forgive me. I smiled because that was what survival demanded. But something shifted inside my chest that day. Something that had been soft became stone. And stone, given enough time and enough heat, does not break. It sharpens. It was a Tuesday. The air that morning had that heavy, wet stillness that comes before Georgia turns truly cruel. I was at the stove when I heard Grace singing outside. That low, sweet hum she did when she was happy, when she felt safe. Then I heard boots. Then I heard Isaiah's voice change into something I had never heard from him before. A sound that was not quite a word, and not quite a scream. Something between the two that lives in a place language was never built to reach. I dropped the skillet and ran to the door. Edmund and his 3 sons had Isaiah by both arms. The large iron cauldron, the one I used for rendering hog fat, had already been dragged into the yard. The fire beneath it was high and deliberate. Someone had planned this. Someone had woken up that morning and chosen this. And my children were already there, standing at the edge of it all, too young to run and too terrified to look away. I fought. I want you to know that first. I was not still. I was not silent. I tore skin with my fingernails, and I bit down on a forearm until I tasted blood that was not mine. But there were hands, too many hands, belonging to men who had spent their whole lives deciding that my body was not my own. They held me at a distance that was perfectly calculated. Close enough to see everything, far enough that I could not reach my family. I screamed Isaiah's name until my throat became raw meat. I screamed grace. I screamed hope. And Edmund Thornwood stood at the edge of that yard with his pocket watch open, timing it all with the same bored expression he wore when he checked the weight of a cotton bale. That watch. I memorized the sound of it snapping shut. I heard it in my sleep for months afterward. When it was over, they let me go. Just like that, they simply released their grip and walked back to the house as if they had completed a chore, as if they had mended a fence or trimmed a hedge. I fell onto the ground, and I stayed there until the sun moved and the shadows changed, and the fire burned itself down to nothing. Someone, I never knew who, eventually covered what remained. I do not remember the hours that followed. I remember the smell. I remember that the magnolia trees were still blooming, indifferent and white, while the world I had built with Isaiah and my girls dissolved into smoke and grease and silence. And I remember the exact moment I stopped grieving and started calculating. It was not dramatic. It was quiet, like a door closing very softly in a room at the end of a long hallway. The first obstacle was my own face. Grief has a way of writing itself across a person's features, in the set of the jaw, in the stillness behind the eyes, in the way the hands move without purpose. I could not afford that, not a single line of it. The morning after, I rose before the stars faded, walked to the water basin, and studied my reflection until I found something I could wear like clothing. a face that was empty in the right places, soft where it needed to be soft. I practiced saying, "Yes, Master," until the words stopped tasting like poison and became simply sounds, hollow and functional, like the noise a door makes when it opens. Old Thomas, the man who hauled wood for the smokehouse, watched me that first week and said nothing for a long time. Then one morning, he pressed my hand between both of his and whispered, "Careful, child." They watched the quiet ones hardest. He was right. And so I learned to be quiet in a way that looked like surrender. At night, when the house settled into its creaking sleep, I lay on my mattress and conducted a different kind of inventory. I counted the hours between Edmund's last bourbon and when his bedroom light went dark. I memorized which floorboards in the main house exhaled underweight and which one stayed silent. I studied Nathaniel's appetite, the way he always reached for a second biscuit before finishing the first. Jeremiah's habit of drinking whatever was placed before him without looking at it first. Caleb's weakness for sweetness, for anything glazed or honeyed, the way a child reaches for candy without thinking. These were not observations. These were measurements. And underneath the kitchen floorboards, wrapped in oilcloth against the Georgia damp, my silent army was growing. Leaf by dried leaf, root by crushed root, patience pressed into powder between two stones, while the rest of the world dreamed its easy dreams. The second obstacle arrived in the form of a woman named Margaret Hale, the plantation seamstress, then as a winter branch with eyes that move like water, finding cracks and stone. She began watching me the third week of October. I felt her attention, the way you feel cold air through a wall, not directly, but present and persistent. One afternoon, she appeared in my kitchen doorway while I was sorting dried herbs, and her gaze moved across my shelves with a slow, professional hunger. "Cooking something special, Maria?" she asked, using the name they had given me, the name that was not mine. I smiled with every muscle in my face except the ones behind my eyes. "Just keeping the pantry organized, ma'am." She stood there 3 seconds longer than necessary. That night, I moved everything deeper under the floorboards, wrapped tighter. I could not afford a single careless moment, not when I was this close. November brought the first frost, and with it, Edmund's announcement that a preacher would be visiting for the holiday season. A man named Reverend Aldous Crane, known throughout the county as a man with sharp instincts and sharper opinions about the natural order of things. He arrived on a grey Thursday with muddy boots and a leather Bible worn smooth at the spine. He sat at Edmund's table and spoke about providence and hierarchy and divine design, while I served his plate and refilled his glass, and became in his presence entirely invisible. But during his second evening, Reverend Crane followed me to the kitchen after supper. He stood in the doorway and watched me work, with an expression I recognized immediately. Not desire, not hunger, but suspicion dressed in theology. "You are remarkably composed for a woman who suffered what you suffered," he said. I kept my eyes on the pot. "The Lord sustains me, Reverend." He left, but he did not stop watching. The night before Christmas Eve, I almost broke. It happened without warning, the way the worst things always do. I was passing the small cemetery at the edge of the cotton field, the one where they had allowed me to bury what remained of Isaiah and my girls. And the moon was full and indifferent, casting everything in a light that made the grave markers look like teeth pushing up through the earth. I stopped walking. My legs simply refused the next step. I stood there in the cold Georgia night, and for the first time in 3 months, I allowed myself to remember Isaiah's hands, the specific weight of them on my shoulders, the way his thumbs knew exactly where the pain lived in my neck after a long day. Grace humming, Hope's laugh, which started in her belly and arrived late, like it had travelled a long distance to reach her face. And I thought, what if I am wrong? What if this is not justice but only more horror, dressed in different clothes? I stood there a long time. Then the wind moved through the cotton, and it sounded just barely like someone whispering my real name, Iomide. And I walked back to the kitchen. The revelation came not from a person, but from a piece of paper. 3 days before Christmas, while collecting Edmund's coat from the study to brush it down, a folded document slipped from the inside pocket and fell open against the floor. I should have replaced it without reading, but the word at the top stopped my breath completely. Samuel, my boy's name, written in Edmund's careful hand above a bill of sale dated 6 weeks prior. Samuel had not been sold to Louisiana. He had been sold to a man in the next county. A man whose property bordered Thornwood land on the eastern edge. Close enough that on still mornings, sound carried across the fields. I had been within earshot of my son for 2 years without knowing it. Edmund had known. Edmund had watched me grieve a child who was close enough to hear me if I called his name loudly enough into the right wind. He had done it deliberately for sport. That document reordered everything I thought I understood about my situation. The cruelty had not been impulsive, it had been architectural. Edmund Thornwood had constructed my suffering the way a man builds a house, beam by beam, decision by decision, with patience and intention and pride in the craftsmanship. The murder of Isaiah and my girls had not been rage or punishment for a specific act. I searched my memory, and I found it a land dispute. A neighbouring farmer had challenged Edmund's eastern boundary. Isaiah, as the most trusted man on the property, had been asked to testify. He had told the truth. Edmund had lost 40 acres, and so Edmund had taken everything Isaiah had instead. My family had been executed as a financial correction. That knowledge did not make me angrier. It made me colder and cold. I had learned by then was far more dangerous than fire. The dilemma lived in my chest like a stone for the final 24 hours, because I had found out where Samuel was. And I knew with the kind of certainty that lives in your stomach rather than your mind, that if I did what I had planned, I would never reach him. The roads would be watched. The county would turn itself inside out looking for a black woman who had poisoned and burned 4 white men on Christmas Eve. I could run before dawn and find my son, and we could disappear together into the northern dark. Or I could stay. I could finish what I had started in that yard in September. I could give Isaiah and grace and hope, the only thing the living can ever truly give the dead. The knowledge that their suffering was not simply absorbed and forgotten, that it had weight, that it registered, that the earth itself recorded what was done to them. 2 roads. One led to my son. One led to my family's grave. I chose both, and that choice told me exactly who I was. Before midnight on Christmas Eve, I slipped out of the plantation and ran the 2 miles of frozen field to the eastern property. I found Samuel in a barn, sleeping under a thin blanket with 3 other boys. I woke him without a sound, just my hand over his mouth and my eyes telling him everything. I held him for 30 seconds, 30 seconds that had to carry 2 years of silence. Then I pressed into his hands the folded document with Edmund's handwriting and the name of a freed black preacher in Savannah that old Thomas had whispered to me weeks before. I told Samuel to run north and not stop and not look back, and that his mother loved him more than God loved his own creation. Then I watched my son disappear into the darkness, and I walked back to Thornwood, back to my kitchen, back to my calderon. Christmas Eve arrived the way judgment always does, quietly, without announcement, dressed in ordinary clothes. The Thornwood women retired early, full of mold, wine, and seasonal satisfaction. By 10, the house had settled into its familiar breathing. Then came the sound of boots on the back porch. 4 sets, heavy and unhurried, belonging to men who had never once considered that the kitchen they were entering might be the last room they would ever see. I had the bourbon poured and the gingerbread arranged on the good china before Edmund's hand touched the door. They sat. They laughed. They spoke about the new year with the easy confidence of men who believed the future belonged to them by birthright. I watched Caleb reach for his second piece before finishing his first, exactly as I had calculated. I watched Jeremiah drink without looking. I watched Nathaniel lick the glaze from his thumb. And I watched Edmund Thornwood set his pocket watch on the table beside his glass. That same watch, that same sound. And I felt something in my chest, finally, completely, go still. It took 11 minutes for the powder to reach their legs. I know, because I used Edmund's own watch to measure it. When his hands began to tremble and his eyes found mine across that kitchen with the first full understanding of what was happening, I did not look away. I held his gaze the way he had held mine in that yard in September, steady, unhurried, certain. I said nothing while I worked the pulley system. I said Caleb's name when it was his turn, and Grace's name after it. I said Jeremiah and Hope together because Hope had gone first, and she had gone fast, and she deserved someone to accompany her. I said Nathaniel and Isaiah because Isaiah had been the strongest and the last, and he had looked for me until he could no longer look. And when Edmund Thornwood finally understood that his last moment would be measured by his own instrument, I snapped his watch shut. I placed it in my apron pocket, and I finished what September had started. I walked out of that kitchen without looking back. The December air hit my face like cold water, clean, sharp, indifferent to everything that had just happened inside those walls. I crossed the frozen yard barefoot, feeling the Georgia earth under my feet for what I knew would be the last time. And I walked to that small cemetery between the cotton fields, where the people I loved were sleeping. I lay down in the narrow space between Isaiah's grave and Hope's, with Grace close enough that I could have reached both of them if the earth had been willing. The sky above me was enormous and full of stars, the same stars that had watched over the Niger Delta the night I was born. the same stars that had guided the ships that brought me here, indifferent then as they were now. But something had changed in the air. The smell of oil and smoke that had lived inside my nose for 3 months was gone, replaced by red clay and winter grass, and something older, the particular scent of African earth that lives permanently in the memory of anyone who has ever known it. I was not Maria the cook anymore. I was not Edmund's property, or George's prisoner, or grief's hostage. I was Iomid, which means in the language my mother spoke. My joy has returned. I closed my eyes. Somewhere to the north, a boy with his father's hands was running toward a life I would never see, but had purchased with everything I had. That was enough. That had always been enough. Some debts can only be paid in full, and I have paid mine down to the very last second.